Hello everyone. In today's class we're going to talk about the lead up to the Second World War and in particular try and get an understanding of France's role in that run up to the war and in particular what the French state tried to do in order to avoid a conflict with Nazi Germany. So let's start in 1919, and in 1919 France is very much the top dog once again in Europe, that the German army having been defeated, having been restricted by the conventions of the Treaty of Versailles, France was in a dominant position. In some ways you could compare France's position in 1919 to that of Germany in 1871, that having been the victor in the recent war, it hadn't really much to gain from another war and therefore sought to avoid future conflict, ideally by isolating its enemy. So just as Bismarck tried to isolate Germany isolate France in the 1870s, so France sought to isolate Germany in the 1920s. In particular, the French state, in order to do this, wanted to find a series of allies who we could collaborate with in order to keep the German threat in check. And one of the obvious, and that was, well, when I say one of the difficulties the French had was that the three main allies they had fought with during the Second World War, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, for a variety of reasons, were no longer suitable as truly committed allies. Soviet Union had replaced Tsarist Russia. That simply, and while that wasn't, they were never going to ally with the Germans, or so the French thought. They were also not going to ally themselves with the French. And in the early 1920s, both the United Kingdom and the United States had shown pretty clearly that they would not help France in enforcing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles upon the Germans. So France was forced to look elsewhere to kind of more mid-sized countries for alliances. And one of the obvious ones was Poland. The French and Polish had a warm relationship over the course of the 19th century, dating back to Napoleon's working with Polish soldiers during his campaign in Russia. And Napoleon had actually established the Duchy of Warsaw, a semi-independent Polish state. And throughout the 19th century, particularly in France, the cause of Polish independence was always celebrated by French Republicans. So the Polish and the French were natural allies now that Poland had re-emerged as an independent state. Of course, Poland had more pressing issues in the first years of existence as the fallout of the Russian Civil War. The Poles found themselves in a war with the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1920. So this is a Polish propaganda poster here, and it says in Polish, "Strike the Bolsheviks." And the French actually sent help. The French sent 400 officers to Poland, not so much that they would fight on the front lines, because obviously 400 is not an awful lot of soldiers, but to impart their military expertise and their organizational abilities to the Polish army. Which brings us to our first Jeopardy question. So this war hero and author of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic of France was awarded Poland's highest military honor. The military honor was the Virtuti Militari, and that was Charles de Gaulle. So Charles de Gaulle, pictured here as a young man, was part of the French military mission to Poland to initially help the Poles stave off the Soviet Union, but they remained in France. French officers remained in Poland for most of the interwar period, and Charles de Gaulle, who we'll obviously see in future lectures, was one of those people who was sent there in 1919. So an alliance was formally concluded. So this is our clip here is from Graveheart, signifying an alliance. An alliance was made between the Polish and the French in 1921, and basically where they offered to help one another in the case of a war, or someone invading or attacking either nation. Of course, the Poles were making this alliance because they wanted allies against a possible invasion from the Soviet Union. The French were doing so because they wanted allies against a possible German attack. And in some ways, the French got the better of the deal in the sense that France really, because of geography, would not be in a position to help the Soviet Union or help Poland if it was ever invaded by the Soviet Union, as frankly was demonstrated in 1939. Whereas Poland would be in a position to help the French because they had a border with Germany. The Polish army had performed actually quite well in the war with the Soviet Union. Actually, by the end of the war, it had actually gained some territory from the Soviet Union. So while an alliance with Poland might not have terrified the Germans, the Polish army was relatively competent, relatively successful, and could be useful in a war with Germany. The French also looked to some of the other European nations, the new European nations of Eastern Europe, as possible allies as well. This image here, and I apologize, the map is in Spanish, I couldn't find one in English. This is from something known as the Little Entente. That is the three countries here, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, the countries that are marked in green, all made an alliance between one another, in particular as a bulwark against Hungarian aggression. There were Hungarian nationals in Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. All three states were worried that the Hungarians would try and conquer those areas or seize those areas from those countries, and they formed an alliance initially against Hungary. But France, over the course of the 1920s, I believe 1924 with Czechoslovakia, 1926 with Romania, and 1927 with Yugoslavia, made an alliance with all three of the members of the Little Entente. Or when I say alliance, sorry, more treaties of friendship. So there wasn't any firm military commitment, but from the French point of view, it was establishing friendly relationships with these nations, which they, at the very least, was deter or removing potential allies from Germany, and which they hoped might lead to a more substantial military alliance going forward. Now, obviously, as we talked about in our earlier class, the 1920s, there was a thaw in German-French relations in the 1920s, symbolized by the Locarno Pact, which we have here. Austen Chamberlain signed the Locarno Pact, behind him Astrid Briand, and Gustav Stresemann behind him. Or Gustav Stresemann behind him, where basically the French and Germans had agreed to recognize one another's border. But this alliance was not particularly well received in Poland, because the Germans explicitly refused to recognize Germany's eastern borders, and obviously the main border Germany had in the east was with Poland. So Joseph Beck was a Polish military officer, and he commented about the Treaty of Locarno. Germany was officially asked to attack the east in return for the west. So in other words, they many people in Poland felt that the French had sold them out in order to kind of stave off German aggression and kind of sacrifice Poland in its place. And there were other signs of a kind of cooling relationship between the Poles and the French in the 1920s. The Polish wanted the French to encourage French investors to invest in Poland, to kickstart the Polish economy, arguing that a more economically vibrant Poland would be a more useful military ally. But the French government demurred on this. The French government was also, while it sent officers to Poland, was kind of rather slow to share its military secrets with Poland. And so, yeah, there was a kind of something of a distrust between the Poles and the French in the 1920s. So, even though there was an alliance, even though the relationship between the French and Germans had somewhat improved in the 1920s, naturally there was still a great deal of skepticism in France about the Germans and German intentions, especially by the mid-1920s. It was becoming quite evident that the Germans were rearming their military in defiance of the conventions of the Treaty of Versailles, and trying to do so secretly. So the French were disappointed that the Americans and British once again weren't taking strong enough action in order to curtail these German rearmament efforts. One of the important strategic changes in French-German relationships came in 1929, something known as the Young Plan. So the Young Plan, this image here, they're from Germany, they're kind of critiquing the Young Plan. The Young Plan basically was a renegotiation of the German war debt, where the amount of money that Germany owed was cut significantly. Although not, it was still quite substantial, which is exactly what these posters are hinting at here. So the 69-year tribute, basically this is a German propaganda poster saying that the German people are being enslaved for in the poster on the right for just a generation, 3 generations, to pay off this war debt still. But one of the terms that the Germans insisted on, that they would not compromise on, was that the French had to remove their soldiers from the Rhineland. So this image here, the image in yellow, is the Rhineland. According to the Treaty of Versailles, French soldiers are to occupy the Rhineland until 1935. And this was an important strategic development for the French. The basic idea was that if the Germans and the French went to war again in between those years, it would be possible for the French to strike directly into the heart of Germany, and that any conflict that would be fought on Germany as opposed to being fought in France. And that kind of reflected the offensive mindset of Ferdinand Foch, who was if you remember, the Allied Supreme Commander at the end of the First World War. However, the Germans insisted that they would not sign off on the Young Plan unless French troops were withdrawn from the Rhineland, and so French troops were withdrawn in 1930, 5 years earlier than they were expected to do so. So even though French troops withdrew, the terms were that the Germans were still not allowed to send their soldiers into the Rhineland, so it still could be used as an avenue of an attack, but it meant that the previously offensive-minded position of the French had to be reimagined because they could no longer have an open pathway directly into the centre of Germany. And so instead, we start getting more of a defensive mindset on the part of the French. So what we had was people like Marshal Pétain and Joffre, some of the commanders of the First World War, who argued that France's approach to any future war with Germany, it would make more sense to think more defensively than offensively. And a key man in this regard was a guy called André Maginot, who was a soldier in the First World War. He also served as French Minister of War for a few different, I think it was in total 3 different sessions, 3 different times in the 1920s and 1930s. He had fought at Verdun, he had actually been wounded at Verdun, but he'd been very impressed by the ability of the defences of Verdun to hold off the Germans, more or less. And his big idea as Minister of War was, why don't we build a huge series of Verdun-like fortifications on our border with Germany to prevent the Germans from invading. And in 1928, the French government finally agreed to this plan and established what is known as the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications. You can see here in the map on the border directly with Germany, in the south here, strong fortifications. A little further north, weaker fortifications, which I'll say more in a second. But these were a series of oftentimes underground forts that were impregnable to assault both from land and air. So these were very, very formidable defensive positions. The French government invested a lot of money into these into the Maginot Line to protect itself as from the Germans. So the basic point being, after in particular once it became obvious that French troops would have to leave the Rhineland, even before the Young Plan, I mean, French army planners understood that eventually the French soldiers would not allowed to remain in the Rhineland. They began shifting towards the Maginot Line. Now, the Maginot Line gets something of a bad rap in popular culture. So here's some memes kind of critiquing the Maginot Line, because obviously, as we know, during the Second World War, the French or the Germans invade France, invade very successfully, and the Maginot Line is unable to stop them, largely because the Germans go through it or go around it more particular. So this is a set of memes. Here's another one, making fun of the fact that the Germans largely went around the Maginot Line. But it's actually a grossly simplistic understanding of the Maginot Line was, and I think it's too simple an understanding of what the French were trying to do. Obviously, the French understood that the Germans could invade through Belgium. The Germans had invaded through Belgium in 1914, so this wasn't like this was a new idea to the French. What the French were actually trying to do was, they realized if they built the Maginot Line where they did, on the direct border with Germany, that then the only 2 ways the Germans could invade France was either through Belgium or Switzerland. And they figured that Belgium or Switzerland, because of its terrain and because of its long tradition of universal male military training, would mean the German attack would have to come through Belgium. So in essence, what they were doing was they were trying to push the Germans or funnel the Germans through an attack through Belgium. And the important point was this: the French had actually made an alliance with the Belgians in 1921, or 1920, being that if the Germans ever attacked Belgium, the French would immediately enter into Belgium to help in their defences. But the logic of this was that any war that was fought would be fought in Belgium, it would not be fought in France. So there was actually deliberate planning behind trying to encourage any German invasion to take place through Germany, with the idea that this would allow the French to know where the Germans are coming from and to stop them before they could actually even enter into France. There was one outspoken critic of this defensive plan of the French, and again it was Charles de Gaulle. In 1934 he published a book called Towards a Professional Army, where he basically said the next war is not going to be a defensive war like the First World War. It's going to be a much more mobile war, and we need to plan and prepare. Essentially what he said, we need to prepare professional tank units to be much more mobile to deal with a French or German invasion. Obviously, the German tactics during the First World War, Blitzkrieg, demonstrate that de Gaulle was largely right. But his book only sold 700 copies, and it was largely ignored by the French military.